This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to provide some help for students getting started in Lesson 4 in the Academy's Greek Grammar 1 course. In these first lessons we're studying the orthography of the Greek language, of ancient Greek. So far we've looked at the alphabet. You've studied the forms and names and sounds of the Greek letters. We've also studied in more detail the vowels of the Greek alphabet. We've looked at the diphthongs that need to be noted in Greek. We've also looked at breathings and how aspiration works in Greek. And in this lesson, we're going to be studying the sounds and the divisions of Greek consonants. Now this is a lengthy lesson. You'll see, I believe it's articles 15 through 22. So if we just scroll down from article 15 down to 22, you'll see there's, or maybe 21 it looks like. No, 22, that's right. Down through 22. So articles 15 through 22. So it's a lengthier lesson, and as you can see, it has got quite a bit of content to it. So we're just going to make our way through this slowly and try to be as clear as we can. But as we go through this, remember, this is just intended to be a pre-lection or an introduction to the lesson that you're going to study. My goal in the pre-lection is to make sure that you get a good survey of the content of the lesson, and also that if there's any new vocabulary in the lesson, new words that you've never seen before, you get to hear them pronounced. So when you read and study them for yourself, you won't come across words whose pronunciation you're not familiar with. So it's just helpful for students to have an introduction or survey to a lesson before they get started with their studies. So let's walk through the content of this lesson, Lesson 4 on consonants, beginning with article number 15. The 17 consonants in Greek are divided into stops or mutes, spirants, liquids, nasals, and double consonants. So we learned that there are 24 letters in the Greek alphabet, and here we see that 17 of them are consonants. 17 of the letters in Greek are consonants, leaving 7 as vowels. And if we take these 17 consonants, we see that they can be divided into 5 different groups. 5 different groups of consonants. The first group is called stops or mutes. The second group is called spirants. The third group is called liquids. The fourth group is called nasals, and the fifth group is called double consonants. So the 17 consonants in Greek can be divided into 5 different groups. We learn here the principle for this division. They may be arranged according to the degree of tension or slackness of the vocal cords in sounding them. This is another method of dividing them. So before I go any further, just to make sure you understand what it means when it says the tension or slackness of the vocal cords. The vocal cords are located in your throat. So if you place your hand on the front of your throat and talk or read something or just hum, you'll feel vibration in your throat. That vibration is your voice. It's the vibration of the vocal cords. The air passes between your vocal cords and causes a vibration that produces the sound of your voice. A good way to think of your vocal cords is to think of a violin with the bow rubbing on the strings of the violin and producing a sound. Imagine if the bow of the violin is your breath and the strings on the violin are your vocal cords. That's how our bodies make voice. We sort of have a built-in violin with the air being the bow that we play these strings with. So the different consonant sounds can be grouped based on whether or not we express voice with our vocal cords, whether we make voice. And you'll see the group here in letter A is voiced consonants. Voiced consonants. Voiced consonants are produced when the vocal cords vibrate. So consonants whose sound includes the vibration of the vocal cords or voice are called voiced consonants. The sounds are represented by the letters beta, delta, and gamma. So if we pronounce the sound of the consonant beta, just make the sound and keep your hand on the front of your throat. B, b, b. You'll feel that your throat, your vocal cords vibrate when you make the sound of the consonant beta. The same is true of delta. D, d, d. You'll feel your vocal cords vibrating, and gamma. G, g, g. These are voiced consonants, and you also see in parentheses that these are stops or mutes. So these are voiced mutes. We then see the Greek letter lambda, lambda, and if you make the sound of the lambda, you'll feel your vocal cords vibrating. La, la, la. The same is true of the consonant rho, rho, rho. These two consonants, lambda and rho, are called liquids. Liquids. They're voiced, liquid consonants. We then see the consonant mu, mu, which is also voiced, m, m. The consonant nu, n. And then you see this here, gamma nasal, and there's a note to Article 19A. Gamma nasal it's simple to understand. In English, we use this sound. Think if we have a word like driving, driving. The ing ending produces this sound where we combine the ng, n, and g. We put them together to make the sound driving, that sound at the end of the word. When two gammas are together, or gamma is before a guttural consonant, and you'll understand more of this as we go, but the first gamma is changed into the sound that we hear at the end of the English word driving, in that ing ending. A good example of this is the word angelos in Greek, angelos, which means angel. If we look at the spelling of the word angelos, we'll actually see that it's alpha, gamma, gamma. So if we just read the word, literally just read the sounds of the letters, it would be aggelos, aggelos. But that's not how it's pronounced. It's pronounced angelos, because that first gamma basically becomes a nu, and it's called gamma nasal. So we'll look at that a little bit later. These three consonants, mu, nu, and gamma, when it's pronounced as a nasal, are called nasals. So they're voiced nasals. And then lastly, the consonant zeta, zeta, and you can hear that vibration in your vocal cords, z, z, z. So all of those consonants, beta, delta, gamma, lambda, rho, mu, nu, gamma nasal, and zeta are called voiced consonants because the vocal cords vibrate when they are pronounced. And note the note here in parentheses, all the vowels are voiced. The word vowel is an English form of the word vocal, and the word vocal comes from vox, which means voice. So obviously all the vowels are voiced. That's what it means to be a vowel. But some consonants are voiced, those that we learn here in Part A of Article 15. Then we have voiceless consonants. You can see these are also called surd. You'll see this word surd in some grammar books, which means hushed or voiceless. So the voice is not used when making the sounds of these consonants. Voiceless consonants require no exertion of the vocal cords. In other words, when you pronounce these consonants, if you pronounce them correctly, you'll notice that your vocal cords do not vibrate. So it may take some practice to make the sound with no vibration. Another problem, before we get into this, another problem is that anytime we make the sound of a consonant, we've got to join it together to a vowel to make the sound. So there's a difference between the use of the voice with the consonant and the voice that's actually produced by the vowel. So you may have your hand on your throat feeling your vocal cords when we make these consonant sounds and think that your vocal cords are vibrating, but note that it's probably the vowel sound and not the consonant sound. So let's walk through these. These are the voiceless or surd consonants. The first one is P or pi. It's the sound, just the popping sound of the lips. And be careful that you don't use too much breath. Just keep it as a simple popping sound of the lips. Pa, pa, pa. If you feel your vocal cords, you'll notice that when you make that popping sound, there's no voice. Now, what's important to note is that the letter beta, which we learned as a voiced consonant, is really the same as P, except we use our voice to make beta, b, and we turn the voice off when we make P, pa, pa, pa. The second voiceless consonant is tau, tau. And you'll see that, again, tau is a voiceless consonant that's like delta without voice. So delta is pronounced d, d. If we turn the voice off, we have ta, ta, a voiceless consonant. Note the relationships between these different consonants. P is like a voiceless beta. Tau is like a voiceless delta. Next we see kappa, kappa, and make sure that when you pronounce kappa, you don't release a lot of breath. Just make it be that clicking sound in your throat, as it were. Ka, 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 like the sound of a crow. Ka, ka, ka. If we think about that voiceless consonant, we'll see it's like the consonant gamma, but without voice. So these three sets of consonants, P, tau, and kappa, relate to beta, delta, and gamma. Beta, delta, and gamma are really the same sounds with voice added. And that's very important because later in our Greek studies, we're going to learn the forms of Greek words, and these forms change. And what you'll notice is that when the forms change, the stems of the words that are changed already have consonants in them, and sometimes the endings and the stems cause some difficulty in pronunciation, and so there are changes made to the forms of the words. And those changes can only be understood if you understand these sounds of the consonants correctly, because you'll find that these voiced consonants will change into the voiceless forms, or the voiceless forms will change into the voiced forms. So it's not random. There is some reason or order to the changes, and you've got to keep this orthography lesson in mind to understand those changes. The next voiceless letter is the letter phi, phi. Now, this is a little bit confusing because in English, we've learned to refer to this as phi or phi, and we make the f sound when we pronounce this letter. But that's really not the true sound of this letter. These three letters, phi, theta, and chi, relate to pi, tau, and kappa. Note that the letter phi, if pronounced correctly, is actually just the P with breath. It's pa, pa, pa. So it's an aspirated P. So beta is a voiced P, and phi is an aspirated P. So pay attention to that relationship. Next we have what's called in English theta, theta, but is pronounced correctly as ta, ta, ta. So it's like tau, but with breath. Tau plus breath makes theta, just like P plus breath makes phi. And lastly, ki is pronounced ka, ka, ka. So we see it's just like kappa, but with breath added. So we've got these three groups of three consonants. P, tau, and kappa are the simple consonant sounds. If we add voice to these, we get beta, delta, and gamma. If we add breath to these, we get phi, theta, and chi. And again, the reason why this is important is because later on, when we start learning about the changing forms of different words in Greek, understanding the relationships between these letters will help you to understand the reasons for those changes. So I'll remind you of that when we get there, but this isn't just a bunch of trivia for you to entertain yourself with. This is actually information about the consonants, about the sounds, which is going to help you understand Greek grammar. So there we have the voiceless stops. We then have the letter sigma, sigma, which is aspirant or sibilant, s. We then have psi, psi, which is a combination of the consonants P and sigma, psi, psi. And you can probably guess that this is what's meant by a double consonant up here in Article 15. Psi, a symbol that represents the pronunciation actually of two consonant sounds. And lastly, xi, xi, which is the combination of kappa and sigma. Xi, xi. All of these are the voiceless consonants. So we've got voiced consonants and we've got voiceless consonants, and notice that they're divided into the groups that are listed up here in Article 15. Stops, spirants, liquids, nasals, and double consonants, sorry. Just to give you a quick definition of what these are, I wouldn't say definition, just a description. Stops are consonant sounds where the voice and breath, I shouldn't say voice, just breath, is actually stopped for a moment for their pronunciation. So they're mutes because they're quiet for a moment. They completely stop the pronunciation of the syllable or word. Spirants are those which use only breath. Liquids are those which are almost vowels. Nasals are those produced in the nose, and double consonants are simple enough. They're two consonants joined into one sound. So we have 5 basic groups of consonants, and they can be further divided into voiced and voiceless, which is pretty simple to understand, I think. All right, down to note C. Arranged according to the increasing degree of noise, nearest to the vowels are the nasals. So the nasals are most like the vowels, in sounding which the air escapes without friction through the nose. So nasals are consonants where the the sound is produced by air moving through the nose. Next come the semivowels, upsilon and iota, and what that means is the consonantal forms of upsilon and iota, which we'll learn more about later. The semivowels are almost vowels, consonantal upsilon and iota, the liquids, and the spirant sigma, in sounding which the air escapes with friction through the cavity of the mouth. Next come the stops, which are produced by a removal of an obstruction. And finally, the double consonant. So you've got a description of each of those 5 groups of consonants there at the end of Article 15, which is worth studying. And we're going to get into them in detail here, and much of what I've just explained we're going to review in the following articles. So let's just keep moving here. In Article 16, we learn about the stops in more details, and it's important for you to note that stops and mutes are the same thing, because you'll see mutes in other grammar books. In this grammar book, we're going to use stops to name these consonants. Stopped consonants are so called because in sounding them, the breath passage is for a moment completely closed. Simple enough. The speech stops for a moment when we pronounce these consonants. The stops are divided into 3 classes according to the part of the mouth chiefly active in sounding them. And they're also divided into 3 orders according to the degree of force in the expiratory effort. So we have the simple idea of stops, which are consonants that stop the speech for a moment. But these are divided into 3 classes according to how they're produced in the mouth, and we'll look at this in a minute, and also into 3 orders based on how much force is used to produce them. And I've already explained that, and we'll see that in this chart here. So what I explained before about the relationships between these consonants is now set into a visual diagram, which will be helpful. First of all, we read that the stops are divided into 3 classes based on where they're produced in the mouth. You can see the first group are labials. These are lip sounds. So P, beta, and phi are produced at the lips. Then we have dental stops. Tau, delta, and theta are produced at the teeth. And we have palatal stops. Kappa, gamma, and chi are produced further back in the mouth with the palate. So labial sounds, dental sounds, and palatal sounds. Now notice, these are together here because P is the basic labial sound, as I explained before. Beta is a P with voice, and phi is a P with aspiration or breath. Tau is the basic dental consonant. Tau with voice makes delta. Tau with aspiration makes theta. Kappa is the basic palatal sound. Kappa plus voice makes gamma, and kappa plus breath makes chi. So you can see these aren't just random consonants, random letters or sounds in Greek. There is a rule behind these different consonants. By combining different sounds, we produced a necessity for different written symbols, and that's what we see here. Understanding this, as I said, is very important as we continue in the study of grammar. So we see how the classes are arranged based on where the sounds are made. Now we also learn about the orders, which has to do with the degree of force that's required to produce these sounds. And you'll see that the arrangement of these consonants into orders relates to what we just learned about the relationships between these consonants. The smooth stops are the basic sounds that I mentioned. P, tau, and kappa. They're pronounced with the least amount of force. P, tau, kappa, p, t, k. They're produced with the least amount of force. Then we've got the middle stops, which are produced with breath, which is like voice, sorry. The middle stops are produced with voice, which is sort of a gentle force, just the vibration of the vocal cords. Beta, delta, and gamma. B, d, g. A little more force required than p, t, k. And then lastly, we have the rough stops, which require forceful breath. We have the phi, which is pronounced p, p, p. We have theta, which is pronounced t, t, t. And lastly, ki, which is k, k, k. So you can see the relationships here between p, beta, and phi, between tau, delta, and theta, and between kappa, gamma, and ki. Now, I've explained that 3 or 4 times, so it should be pretty clear, but as you study this lesson, make sure you remember the relationships between these 9 consonants. They have a special relationship. First of all, they're all stops, but second of all, they are simply variations based on the use of breath and voice. So keep that relationship in mind. Let's move on here. Note A under Article 16 says, the dentals are sometimes called linguals. They're sometimes called linguals because even though they're made at the teeth, they're made with the tongue. So you can't make the tau, delta, or theta sounds without using the tongue. So some grammar books might refer to them as linguals instead of dentals. Some even refer to them as linguodentals. The rough stops, so that would be phi, theta, and ki, the rough stops, are also called aspirates. That means breathed sounds because they're sounded with a strong emission of breath. That's simple enough. The smooth stops, that is the basic stops, the smooth stops are thus distinguished from the rough stops by the absence of breathing. The rough breathing symbol here, which is transliterated with the English H, the rough breathing mark is also considered an aspirate, so it's almost like a consonant, that breathing symbol. The middle stops owe their name to their position in the above grouping, which is that of the Greek grammarians. So beta, delta, and gamma are called middle simply because they lie in between the smooth stops and the rough stops. All right, so that's Article 16. Everything you need to know about the stops in Greek consonants. Next we have the spirants. There is one spirant, the letter sigma, which also is called a sibilant. Sibilant. A spirant is heard when the breath passage of the oral cavity, that means the mouth, when the breath passage of the oral cavity is so narrowed that a rubbing noise is produced by an expiration or by the breath. So the breath produces a rubbing noise, and that rubbing noise is called a spirant. So it's the friction caused by the breath moving through the teeth that produces the sigma. S, s. That hissing sound is a spirant sound produced by the air producing a rubbing noise on the teeth. Next, in Article 18, we learn about the liquids. We learn there are 2 liquids, lambda and rho. Lambda and rho. The initial rho always has rough breathing. So anytime a word begins with the letter rho, it will have rough breathing added to it. Excuse me. Next, in Article 19, we learn about the nasals. Those are the consonants where the sound is produced through the nose. We learn that there are 3 nasals: the letter mu, the letter nu, and gamma nasal, which is palatal. So mu is labial. It's produced by the air and voice moving through the nose, but also using the lips to produce that m sound. So it's a nasal with respect to the air and labial with respect to the place where the sound is produced. Nu is dental because we use the teeth, and gamma nasal is palatal. It's produced in the top towards the back of the mouth. But these are the 3 nasals: mu, nu, and gamma nasal. Note A here says that gamma before the consonants kappa, gamma, ki, and xi is called gamma nasal. This is what I was describing before. So if we find a word where gamma comes before kappa, gamma, ki, or xi, it doesn't make the sound of a normal gamma. It makes this gamma nasal sound. The note here says that it had the sound of N in think. You can hear that nasal sound that's sort of like an N, but it's more like the gamma because it's pronounced in the throat. The gamma nasal. It had the sound of the N in think. Just say that slowly and concentrate on that N. Thing. That sound. That's the gamma nasal. So whenever gamma comes before kappa, gamma, ki, or xi, it's pronounced with the sound of N in think. This is represented by N in Latin, but it's a gamma in Greek. So we've got some examples here which will make this clear, and I'll pronounce these for you. This first word, you can see alpha, and then you see gamma before kappa. Gamma before kappa, just like it says, gamma before kappa. You see that example. So if we read this and didn't know this rule, we would read ag, kura, ag, kura, and that would not be correct. Notice also it's hard to pronounce that gamma followed by a kappa. Ag, kura, ag. You're sort of choking as you try to pronounce those 2 consonant sounds. So, for the sake of easier pronunciation, that gamma is pronounced with that gamma nasal sound, just to make pronunciation easier. It's pronounced as ankura, ankura. So you can see how that gamma sound is changed, and we say ankura. And it's transliterated into Latin with an N rather than a gamma. This represents the gamma nasal, ankura. The second example, we see alpha, gamma before gamma. Alpha, gamma before gamma. And here we read gamma before gamma is called gamma nasal. So if we just read these letters, we would say ag, gelos, ag, gelos. But that's not correct because that first gamma is changed to gamma nasal. Angelos, angelos. And remember, that changes just to make pronunciation easier. Angelos. And that's the Greek word for angel, angelus. And then lastly, we have sigma, phi, iota, gamma, xi. Sigma, phi, iota, gamma, xi. So we have gamma before xi. That's called gamma nasal. So this word we have sphinx, sphinx. And we see the Latin transliteration, sphinx. we see that gamma before the xi is transliterated with an N. Sphinx, sphinx. So these are good examples that make clear what's meant by gamma nasal. And you just have to remember that when you see words where gamma, it comes before kappa, gamma, ki, or xi. Now, this isn't just a rule that has to be memorized. It's very simple. If gamma, which is a palatal sound, comes before another consonant, which is also a palatal or guttural sound, it's pronounced as gamma nasal. So it's not difficult to understand. It's just for the sake of making pronunciation easier. So that's the note there on the gamma nasal. All right? Next, note B here under Article 19 says the name liquids, which we saw up here in Article 18, the name liquids is often used to include both liquids and nasals. I was going to comment on that before because our lesson says that there are two liquids, lambda and rho, and I know that normally mu and nu are also included with the liquids. So this note is helpful to avoid confusion. The name liquids is often used to include both liquids and nasals. So that's helpful to know. Article 20, semivowels. Semivowels. In Greek, the word semi means half or part of. So you can sort of guess what this word means. Semivowels means half vowels. We see that the only semivowels are iota and upsilon. I'm sorry, not the only. These two, I just want to make it clear that these two consonants, iota and upsilon, are actually vowels in certain places where they make the sound of a consonant, usually when they come before other vowels. So we're not saying that these are consonants, we're saying that the vowels iota and upsilon can be used in a way in certain places where their sound is more like the sound of a consonant. They're called semivowels because they're almost vowels. We see the liquids are also considered semivowels because they're almost vowels, nasals, and the spirant sigma. All of these are consonants, but they don't have that violent stopping force that the stops have. Right? We saw up here that the stops are consonants because the breath passage is for a moment completely closed. They're very strong consonants. Whereas the other consonants, spirants, liquids, nasals, those do not have a strong consonant sound. They do not stop the speech, and therefore they're like vowels. They're sort of in between the stops and the vowels, semivowels. All right? Now we've got some notes here under Article 20 on iota and upsilon. When the vowels, iota and upsilon, the sound they make in a certain syllable or word, correspond to the English letters Y and W. And they give examples that aren't very helpful because they don't include a Y or a W. So an example of a consonantal iota being like the English Y would be like the English word yes, yes. That y sound is produced by this vowel coming before another vowel. If we say e and then move into the eh sound, we'll have that yeah, yeah. It produces that sound of the English Y. The same is true for the upsilon. If it's followed by another vowel and we say them quickly, like alpha, ua, 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 that upsilon has the sound of the English W. And so even though these are vowels, they can, when they're followed by other vowels, they can make a sound that sounds like a consonant. So they're included with the semivowels. Okay? Then we've got some historical note. These historical notes you can usually skim over or ignore. Historical notes become helpful if later in your studies you choose to read authors from different periods. So if you get further back, when we talk about classical Greek, we're usually talking about the Greek language as it was spoken during the classical period of Greek history. So if you go back from the classical period to the time of Homer, 300 years or 400 years before the classical period, the Greek of Homer is going to be slightly different from the Greek that was spoken by Aristotle. Likewise, if you go to the Greek that was used by the apostles, their Greek in the 1st century AD is different in some ways, some minor ways is different from the Greek that was spoken by Aristotle and Plato during the classical period. So if you get into different authors in the future and you're reading Greek from different periods, you're going to have to do some study to understand the differences between the different periods. And there are whole books written on those subjects, so it's not something you would need to worry about now. If you ever get to that point in your studies, there are plenty of resources to help you understand those things. So just some historical notes. Note B here under Article 20 says, the form of many words is due to the fact that the liquids, nasals, and sigma may fulfill the office of a vowel to form syllables. So this is simply a note, as I mentioned before, these details about the linguistics or the sounds of the letters, it's not just a bunch of trivial information. Later, when we study the forms of words, there are going to be changes and things that happen to the words that if you don't have these linguistic lessons in mind, they'll seem random, like things just change all over the place. But if you understand what we've learned about the consonant sounds, the different consonant sounds, and how they relate to one another, when you see those changes, you're going to be able to understand why those changes are taking place. And we'll talk about that when we get there. Lastly, Article 21, double consonants. Very simply, there are 3 of them in Greek: zeta, xi, and psi. Zeta, xi, and psi. Now, the letter zeta can be a little confusing because there are 2 different ways that it's pronounced, and we'll see that here in the note. We'll see zeta is a combination of 2 consonants, sigma delta or delta sigma. Now, there are 2 different, I guess I could say, preferences for pronunciation. Normally, when you hear me pronouncing it, you're going to hear me pronounce delta sigma, z, z, z. But there are some who pronounce it as sigma delta, st, st, st. It's just 2 different ways of pronouncing this Greek letter zeta. Either way, it's a double consonant. And then they also give us this delta iota, but that iota is this consonantal iota, the semi-vowel. So it would be pronounced like dia, dia, dia. These would be considered double consonants. That's why zeta, because it can be used to make these different sounds, is a double consonant. Xi is pretty simple. It's the guttural sound followed by the sibilant sigma sound. And it's true for any of the guttural sounds followed by sigma. So we have kappa sigma, gamma sigma, and chi sigma. X, x, and x. So the letter xi can represent any of those combinations. And then the same is true for psi. It can represent ps, bz, or ps. So again, you see this kappa, gamma, chi. Kappa is the basic sound. Gamma is the voiced sound. Chi is the aspirated. P is the basic sound, beta is the voiced sound, phi is the aspirated sound. Psi represents any of those three consonant sounds followed by sigma. Xi represents any of these three consonant sounds followed by sigma, and zeta could be zd, z, or d. So that's all for the double consonants, and that's really all for the content of Lesson 4. Now in Article 22, we simply have a table that summarizes everything that we've studied in Articles 15 through 21. So you should be able to walk through this table and understand everything that it shows you based on what we've just studied. We see that there are divisions of the consonants into nasals, semivowels, liquids, spirants, stops, and double consonants. We see that nasals are voiced, semivowels are always voiced, liquids are always voiced, spirants can be voiced or voiceless, stops can be voiced, voiceless, or voiceless aspirates, double consonants can be voiced or voiceless. And then you've got the consonants actually filled into the table in each of these rows, and you can see up here the class is based on where the sounds are produced. Labials produced at the lips, dentals produced at the teeth, and palatal produced at the palate, or gutturals. They're produced sort of in the top and back of the mouth. All right, so that brings us to an end of the content here in Lesson 4. We've looked at Articles 15 through 21, and again, Article 22 is simply a summary of all of that in a table, which might be helpful to copy or print and keep on hand in the future. So that's all for the content of Lesson 4. Now remember, that's just intended to be a survey or introduction to this lesson. There's a lot of content in this lesson. I think I've explained just about everything that was included in the lesson. So hopefully that gets you off to a good start. But now you've got to study this lesson for yourself. You've got to study this lesson carefully for mastery, and then complete the assignments to prove that you've mastered this content. Remember, and I really want to stress this isn't just a bunch of useless information. Understanding the relationships between these different consonants is going to make your ability to learn the forms of Greek words much, much easier, because you're going to understand why the changes are as they are. So take your time, review the previous lessons, make sure you know all the names of the letters, make sure you know all their sounds, make sure you know the vowels and their sounds, make sure you know the diphthongs and their sounds, make sure you remember how the breathing marks are to be read, and then in Lesson 4, make sure you learn the divisions of consonants and the principles according to which they're divided, why they're divided as they are, and what the different consonant sounds represent, because there is a science to it. It's not just a bunch of random sounds. There is a science to these consonants, and it's important for you to understand. If you have any questions about anything that I've discussed, I do this without notes. I do this, all in one recording. So I may have, along the way, I may have misspoken something or said something that was a little confusing. If there's anything like that, or if you'd just like to know more information about something that I mentioned, post your questions on the support forums on the course page, and I'll provide responses to help you out there. But it's time for you to study now, so study this lesson for mastery. Complete your assessments in the lesson, and then once I see your assessments come in, I'll be able to judge how well you're doing in mastering the content. And if you haven't mastered it, I'll let you know and tell you to review it and resubmit your assessments. And if things look good, we'll move on to the next lesson and continue learning Greek grammar. I hope that's helpful. God bless.